Good evening and welcome to Newsmax TV's coverage of America Votes 2016 as we focus on what I'm calling Super Duper Tuesday, with primaries taking place in 5 states today. I'm J.D. Hayworth, and let's again review the math. What's at stake? Winner take all in the Sunshine State of Florida, 99 Republican delegates up for grabs, and what appears to be make or break for home state Senator Marco Rubio. Ditto in Ohio, where that state's governor, John Kasich, sees his presidential hopes hanging by a thread. 66 delegates are the prize in another winner-take-all primary. My native North Carolina's 72 delegates will be divided proportionately. And as for Illinois and Missouri, they're divided up proportionally, with some factors weighing in that could make them winner-take-all. We'll explore that more in depth a little bit later in our program tonight. And as for the delegate count at this hour, Republicans in the Northern Mariana Islands already awarded their 9 delegates to Donald Trump today. So here is the updated count. Donald Trump with 469 delegates, Ted Cruz in second with 370, Marco Rubio 163, and John Kasich, and even 100 behind Rubio, 63 delegates, and that is why Governor Kasich is putting all of his energy into his home state of Ohio. This reminder, what it takes to secure the Republican nomination: 1,237 delegates. With that background now, let's bring in our panel. And first of all, let's call on the man that you see typically every weeknight at this time, 7 o'clock Eastern, from Newsmax, New York, our good friend Steve Malzberg. Also, we have tonight via Skype Ed Pozzuoli. He is the president of the Tripp Scott Law Firm. He was also the co-chair of Jeb Bush for Governor campaign and part of the Bush Cheney Legal Team in the 2000 presidential recount in Florida. And from the Queen City of the West, Cincinnati, Ohio, the former mayor of that city and former Secretary of State in Ohio, Ken Blackwell. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Ken, let me go to you first. What is happening in Ohio? What has been the turnout?
This is a robust turnout. In 2012, there was an extraordinarily low turnout. This is more on par with 2008, but the intensity is on the Republican side. And this looks like it's going to be a barn burner and nail biter between Governor Kasich and Donald Trump.
Ed Pozzuoli, in Florida, obviously you are working with and for Jeb Bush, a longtime supporter. Governor Bush left the campaign. Marco Rubio, as a favorite son, needs to win tonight to keep his hopes alive. What have you heard about Florida turnout tonight?
Well, remember, the first thing is about 1.2 million Floridians voted before Election Day through absentee and early voting. That's an important factor. We're looking at a strong turnout, probably upwards of 65%.
65% would be something, and I think I saw evidence, Steve Malzberg, of just how many Floridians voted early, as Ed Pozzuoli says, over 1 million, because the turnout at, dark 30, or really at 7 o'clock Eastern time, when I went to my polling place in Florida, there were only about 7 people in front of me. But Steve, as you sit there in New York and talk to so many people across the country, your take on some of the questions you think maybe we may see answered tonight.
Well, I think we're going to get a clue as to how this violence at the Trump rallies has played out. We're going to get a clue as to whether or not parading around with Mitt Romney really helps you, as in the Kasich case in Ohio. We're going to get a clue as to whether or not that the public is on to the fact that every one of the other 3 presidential candidates blamed Donald Trump the same way Hillary did, the same way Bernie did, the same way the left-wing media did for the radical left-wing organized violence at his campaign stops. So I think this will tell a lot. And in Florida, from what I understand, we have 15 to 1/3%, 15 to 33% of the voters making up their minds in the final days. That's a kind of a significant amount to go with the early voting that took place, and it's about 20% for Democrats in Florida as well. So I think in addition to the delegate count, we're going to be able to read a lot into who wins the states and what it means for the delegate count.
Steve, since you mentioned Mitt Romney and what is transpiring in Ohio, let's return to the Buckeye State and to Cincinnati with Ken Blackwell. Ken, you obviously are a voter in Cincinnati. You obviously are a Republican. Mitt Romney showing up to campaign alongside Governor Kasich. Mitt Romney with robocalls. Mitt Romney's PAC putting out an ad with women disparaging Donald Trump, reading some comments that Mr. Trump made in the past. Are things getting worse? Is the division growing greater here on this primary day in Ohio than perhaps what we've seen heretofore?
Well, what you have to remember is if Rick Santorum had a little bit of money in 2012, he would have won Ohio, not Mitt Romney. And the bleeding of the Kasich campaign is among working class, blue collar Ohioans. And as a consequence, I think that in the closing few days, Mitt Romney was the wrong messenger. But I think what's important to understand is Ohio is an open primary state, which means that a Democrat or an independent can go in and ask for a Republican ballot. Now that means that they have to be willing to be identified as a Republican for the next 2 to 4 years, but they in fact can go in and get that ballot. What we know is that it wasn't an accident that Donald Trump ended his push in Ohio in Mahoney County, up near Youngstown. And what we have seen in those polls, where there are a lot of Democrats came in and asked for the Republican ballot, and you have to feel that will accrue to Donald Trump's benefit.
I think about Youngstown, Ken. I think about the blue-collar workers up there, the so-called Reagan Democrats of the past. Of course, anecdotally, you had a situation where John Kasich is claiming he is the Republican Democrats would be most likely to support. Any evidence you've seen in Cincinnati or Columbus or anywhere around the Buckeye State that Democrats and independents are getting into the Republican primary to vote specifically for Governor Kasich?
Not to the degree that they're getting in to vote for Donald Trump. Look, for all of those Republicans and conservatives that want to stop Donald Trump, they are momentarily rooting on Kasich. Now, the question will be how many conservative Republicans, sort of held their nose and voted for Kasich after criticizing his approach to Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, you name it, as well as his sort of aggressive attitude towards fracking and to the dismay of a lot of folks who were dependent on the uptick in the economy related to fracking for improved economic conditions. So look, at the end of the day, John Kasich is a governor. He won by about 38 points. He in just less than 2 years ago. He, in fact, controls the political on-the-ground apparatus of the Ohio Republican Party. Look, the question that we have is, like Florida, in early voting, how much of the results are already cooked in the cake, baked in the cake?
And speaking of results and what we're going to see tonight, both in Ohio and Florida, let's make note of the fact, John Bogman mentioned it earlier, as we're about 10 minutes past 7 Eastern time, most of the polls in Florida have closed. Of course, you have the Panhandle in the Central Time Zone. We're waiting for some results. You can see a trickle of results coming in right now. 1% of precincts reporting you see Donald Trump out to a commanding lead. Later in this broadcast, Newsmax TV political analyst Dick Morris will be here to interpret the numbers and what comes next. But to Ed Pozzuoli, who played a part in that interesting count in the presidential race in Florida in 2000, Ed, I would have to give the Sunshine State high marks in terms of making sure that voters are who they say they are. As a Florida resident voting for the first time in the midterm, and again this morning, it is very impressive what has happened in this state in terms of voter safeguards.
It's been a long time since 2000, and they've done a lot county by county. And JD, remember, Florida is a closed primary, so only Republicans are going to vote today. However, it's important to point out that over 200,000 new Republicans statewide have signed on to the GOP in the last 9 months, and a lot of that is attributed to Donald Trump.
And
That's a really important point.
And as we take a look at the screen, again, it's worth noting 1% of precincts reporting in the Sunshine State, you see Donald Trump with a huge lead, 62% to 18% for Marco Rubio, 14% for Ted Cruz, and likewise 14% for John Kasich. Steve Malzberg at Newsmax New York. The Cruz campaign was making much of what they called a last-minute surge in Illinois. What have you heard about Ted Cruz, and will he surprise anybody tonight?
I don't know. I mean, Ted Cruz is at a very pivotal point as well, and I don't think enough people have talked about that. We talk about Kasich if he doesn't win Ohio, Rubio if he doesn't win Florida. What is Ted Cruz going to win? There are evangelical states here. There's North Carolina. There's Missouri. He's got to win where he's expected to win, where he has not won. There were states that we have talked about in previous shows that were tailor-made for him. But he doesn't win them. Trump wins them. And, everybody talks about, well, Kasich will get out and Rubio will get out, and then it's going to be a different race, and don't count out Cruz. And, but Cruz isn't winning where he expects to win. So he has something to prove here tonight as well, not just Marco Rubio in Florida and Kasich in Ohio.
Ken Blackwell in Ohio, having served as Secretary of State, and that, in essence, is the chief elections officer in the Buckeye State. What might surprise the rest of America about Ohio and its electoral makeup? Anything that people might be surprised by tonight?
Well, I think a big question will be the demographic breakout of how millennials vote, to what degree they are charged and ready to go. Can Kasich turn the millennial voter out for his crafted victory? I do want to go back to Steve's point. There's no logical path to the nomination for Kasich or for Rubio. There is a path for Cruz if he can get it down to a two-person race. Now, you're absolutely right. He has to do well and win a fair portion of Illinois. He has to win a fair portion of Missouri and North Carolina. If he gets blown out of those three states, then it's going to be a much steeper climb. But if he can run competitively there and get it down to a two-person race, all he has to do is to take about 55% of the remaining voters. And let me tell you, June 7th is a big date. There are 300 delegates that are going to be in play. And right now, Trump is not trending well on the West Coast and in California. And that's going to be an interesting thing to watch.
But a long time between now and June 7th. To
Absolutely.
The primaries today. Candidates making their final push. Florida Senator Marco Rubio in West Palm Beach earlier today, presenting his closing arguments to the electorate.
My whole life I've been told being humble is a virtue. And now, being humble is a weakness, and being vain and self-absorbed is somehow a virtue. My whole life I've been told no matter how you may feel about someone, you respect everyone because we are all children of the same God.
So Marco Rubio with his comments, again, as we take a look at the vote coming in. Donald Trump with a substantial lead. Ed Pozzuoli, I suppose the question is tonight, how badly will Marco Rubio lose his home state to Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think that's really the takeaway. There are two takeaways here. If Donald Trump really runs away with Florida in a big way, what that says across the country is Florida is such a diverse state, JD, that if he could win here in a big way, he can virtually win anywhere across the country because of the three kind of states that we are in South Florida, Central Florida, and North Florida, three very different and diverse areas. And if he can win Florida big, that sends a real message to the balance of the primary calendar. Lastly, on Marco Rubio, he has to be careful. If he loses tonight, he needs to be careful to protect his brand for whatever political future he hopes for.
Well, to that end, we want to explore that a bit more as we continue. But Steve Malzberg, let me come to you because so many New Yorkers come to Florida. Our own CEO, Chris Ruddy, on our program Battleground Florida, outlined much of what Ed had to say a second ago. The Sunshine State becomes a microcosm for the rest of America, albeit most of the North moves to South Florida and most of the Southern heritage is in the northern part of the state. Your take on Marco Rubio's future and how badly he may end up losing tonight, Steve?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the analysis we just heard. I think this is much more about how well Donald Trump does and what it says about Donald Trump than what it says about Marco Rubio. Look, Marco Rubio is going to lose Florida. He's going to lose it big. He's known that. We've known that. And some urged him in his own camp reportedly to get out before tonight to save his political skin to one extent or another. I don't know what the political future is for Marco Rubio. Can he regroup and recover and run for governor of that state? Does he seek a Senate seat down the line again? I have no idea. But I think this is so key. If Trump wins by, big double digits in Florida, and we look at the demographics and we see that he won across the board, well, then what are they talking about when they're calling him a bigot and an Islamophobe and an anti-immigrant and this? Well, they don't like him and they don't like him and women don't like him and they don't like him. Well, people like him, and to Marco's statement that we heard earlier. It's not so. Yeah, he comes off arrogant. He comes off self-absorbed, and maybe he is. But he's a showman. People aren't looking at Donald Trump in the context of a politician acting that way. He's a non-politician acting that way or being that way. It's who he is, and it's resonating. It's to his advantage, not a detriment to him.
About a minute, 15 seconds remains, Ed Pozzuoli, and we take a look at the irony of what happened in Florida. It used to be this primary, delegates were rewarded proportionately, and yet the state party made a change to winner take all. I assume because they presumed it might help Jeb Bush. Now it's Donald Trump who appears poised to gain this winner take all faction. A minute to you for the last word here, Ed.
Actually, it's important, at least under our circumstances today, because if Donald Trump wins Florida and runs the table tonight or has a really good night, we avoid or have a real potential of avoiding a brokered or contested convention. And that's really important. I think establishment needs to understand that the voters' will in a long primary system needs to be respected. Jeb Bush said it right at the end of South Carolina. He said, I listened to the voters' will, and it's clear when he got out of the race. I think we need to see some of that after tomorrow.
Ed Pozzuoli in Florida, Ken Blackwell in Cincinnati. Gentlemen, we thank you. And of course, Steve Malzberg at Newsmax New York. Steve, we ask you to stay with us. Indeed, we ask you, wherever you're watching this tonight, to keep it right here with Newsmax TV as we continue to monitor the results. And there you see Trump basically with a 2-1 margin over Marco Rubio in Florida. Super Duper Tuesday, America Votes 2016. Our coverage continues here on Newsmax TV as we will welcome in Dick Morris and more guests to analyze what is happening and why. Stay with us here as our coverage continues live tonight on Newsmax TV.